My name is Faruk Ates. I'm a product designer, developer. I've basically done the whole spectrum of anything related to making websites or web applications. So from backend and database programming all the way to high-level product design and conceptual business strategy, etc. But today I'm going to talk about constraints, the things that limit freedom. And of course, on the sound of it, constraints sound like a bad thing. You know, they don't sound like something you'd want. They don't sound like something you'd enjoy. You know, something that limits my freedom. I don't want that. Americans don't want that. Mind you, I'm Dutch, despite my heavily American accent. I live in San Francisco and have for a couple of years. So, excuse the American accent. I feel at home here in a country full of people who bike. It's great. So anyway, I created Modernizer. Who here has heard of Modernizer? Cool. Okay, so Modernizer is a JavaScript library that helps you work with CSS3, HTML5, all these new technologies being put into browsers. It's an open source project. We have like 50 plus contributors at this point, and it's pretty popular. You know, it's actually kind of the third library right after like jQuery and jQuery UI, which I don't know if that counts even. But so anyway, constraints. I don't like constraints, right? I want freedom. But constraints are everywhere. They're literally everywhere. The rooms surrounding us, the streets that we drive and bicycle on, balance in our bank accounts. Constraints also are our legal system, which provides us with the stability and morality and the systems in place for us to pursue the freedoms that we enjoy and that are beneficial to us. Freedoms to pursue dreams and careers and hobbies and whatever else we may want. So constraints are all around us, and for the most part, they actually serve a pretty good purpose. But I think they're more than that. I think there's an innate beauty to a constraint in whatever form it may come. It doesn't always have to be positive, but it certainly can be very positive. For instance, this is Gary Chang. He's a Hong Kong-based architect. And he grew up and lived most of his life in literally a 35 square meter apartment. That is smaller than this stage. That is like half this stage. Maybe even less than that. It's really small. And that was his life. And he felt really trapped because it was arranged as any apartment or house really is. You know, there's the bedroom over there, there's the kitchen, there's the sort of a living room area, you have the bathroom, and that was sort of it. But it was all very tiny and cramped because it's Hong Kong. Space is extremely valuable there. And he didn't like that. He was an architect, so he worked within this physical constraint of the apartment unit that he lived in, and he turned it into something that has over 30 fully livable rooms in it. So he made adjustable interior walls that can move around, they can be flipped over, up and down, however you want, or however he wants it. So he has a library, he has a den, he has a living room with a big TV, he has a full kitchen, he has a spacious bathroom, and he has a very comfortable bedroom with a queen-sized bed. And he did all that within the constraints of the physicality of his tiny, tiny apartment by thinking in a very different way about what he could do with that sort of space. And admittedly, lots of money, but I think this is a great apartment. And I would actually love to have maybe something a little bit bigger. I'm fairly tall. But I would love to see more of that elsewhere in the world, because it's such an efficient use of space. And generally, we can only be in one room at the same time. And when we have guests over, we don't really need to show them the bedroom so much. So I think this is a really awesome thing that he worked within these constraints. But he wasn't even the first. In 1924, the Dutch architect Gerrit Rietveld was commissioned by a woman to build a house, and her request was, "I'd like a house without walls." Okay, so how do you do a house without walls? You know, it's kind of a weird commission for an architect. But he kind of worked with that challenge, and he thought very differently about everything about architecture and everything he had ever learned, everything he'd ever thought of doing or did before. He thought differently about everything, and he had to. So he built something where the interior walls, again, are adjustable, not quite as much as Gary Chang's apartment, but the whole place has these areas where they sort of flow into the outside. And you kind of have this feeling of extreme spaciousness because you never feel fully enclosed by four walls. Of course, it still has four walls around you, but it's all very differently designed and architected, and it feels very different and unique. And as a result, this house, I mean, now if you were to see this photo or see a house like this somewhere, you'd think, oh, you know, it's built somewhere in the last 20 years, maybe 15. Feels very modern. But this was built 90 years ago. And it's because the constraint of his extremely unusual commission that he ended up with such a forward-looking aesthetic. And this was also part of the things that introduced the style, which is a pretty well-known Dutch design and aesthetic movement that began around that time. Now, of course, we also have financial constraints. Every project has a budget, limitations. And this sommelier had a very limited budget. She was just starting out. She didn't have a lot of money for a branding or design or anything like that. But the design firm Concern figured out a way to work within that extreme financial constraint. And they gave her this beautiful branding. Incredibly elegant. Every business card is unique. But put two together and you can tell this is like a cohesive whole. This is something that fits together beautifully. This is something that is designed specifically to be this way. And all they did was take a couple of wine bottles and stamp the glasses across everything. And she had this beautiful branding that fit her so perfectly. And it didn't cost much. This was the cheapest, but very effective branding that they could offer. You can also impose arbitrary constraints, and I'm kind of a fan of that. Arbitrary constraints really mean you impose something that you don't necessarily have to. You have more freedom than this. You can use it if you want. But Instagram chose not to. They chose to keep their photos square. Now, a lot of people go like, well, they simulated Polaroid. But Polaroid's photos weren't actually square. For the most part, they were near square. They were rectangular. Instagram came up with this in simulation, perhaps, of Polaroid, but it became their identity. And they started as an iOS-only app at a time where iPhones and iPod Touches were only the 3:2 resolution and took photos that were 3:2 resolution. So they had to crop every photo. And they had to kind of break a certain convention about photography and storytelling, because there's elements to the 3:2 aspect ratio which help tell a story and frame a picture, make something more memorable. But they figured out a way to make it memorable after all. And part of that was this arbitrary constraint that they imposed on themselves, which then led to, it opened doors to new forms of creativity and new options, new design opportunities that they then pursued. And it also gave them a unique style that helped set them apart from all competitors. You see a square photo, you think Instagram, especially nowadays, but even in the very early days when they just started out, they were kind of known for the square photo thing. And they were very popular from day one. Another one is attention spans. It's not as well known among presenters and even conference organizers, but when there's more than 5 seconds of reading material on a slide, people stop listening to the speaker. Because research shows that people are really bad at multitasking for more than 5 seconds. When we have different methods of communication going in, we can only really manage 5 seconds of it for more than one at a time, and then we start to phase one of them out. This is where death by PowerPoint comes from. Not so much that it's bullets on a slide, but that there's so much text. And people think, oh, it's on the slides, it must be important. You put it on the slide. But that's not really helpful because people lose attention. They stop listening to you as a speaker, and they have to dilute their attention gets diluted, and the experience gets kind of worse for both me as a presenter, or you as a presenter, and everyone in the audience. Now, not everyone is unaware of this. TED is pretty famously aware of this, but they think of it in a slightly bigger picture. They did the research, or they looked at research about the human attention span for big topics in general. How long can people really comfortably and cogently sit and watch and hear about a certain topic, and take it all in, and retain as much as possible? And that limit is about 20 minutes. Guess how long TED Talks are? 18 to 19 minutes. They're limited based on the human attention span. And I mean, who here has seen a TED Talk? Right? Everyone, or almost everyone. And for the most part, they're really good talks. I mean, of course, they have a good selection of very high-profile people, and they train them, but it helps that these talks are very memorable because they fit exactly within our attention span for anything that isn't our personal field of expertise, our personal domain that we know a lot about. It's a bike for biking your bikes around. I kind of like this. In North America, as the cities were being built there, they had lots of space. Loads of physical space that they could take advantage of. Build houses, give everyone a garden, front and backyard, picket fence around them, lots of space. And then going to a store to buy groceries or do anything at all, kind of tedious. Either a really long walk, well, it's just easier to drive. And with all that space, even in the densely populated cities, people drive everywhere. They drive just 2 blocks or maybe 4 blocks to the corner store because it's 4 long blocks to walk. The whole culture exists around driving there. It's slowly changing, but here in Europe, I mean, everyone here who lives in Denmark or any other Western European country knows. Biking is pretty popular. It's efficient, it's effective, it's healthy. But you do need infrastructure that is safe for biking, that stimulates it, that makes it appealing for you to bike. And they don't have that in North America. For the most part, it's really freaking dangerous. Also because drivers there are not used to bikes, because no one ever freaking bikes anywhere. Here in Europe, we've had cities built for over 2,000 years now that we still live in. We've had extreme space constraints, forcing us to think very differently about how modes of transport, how to get around, how to be efficient about just doing your daily routine. North America, not so much. And you can really see the difference. And now they're slowly coming around to try and get a biking culture there because, hey, it's healthy and efficient and it doesn't cost you expensive fuel. And you don't have to buy an electric car to feel good about not making the environment bad or worse. So these space constraints that evolved sort of naturally here, they never applied them in North America, and now they're sort of paying the price in many ways. What about software? Who here thinks they can write zero-bug software? Almost no one, right? But if you work at NASA, or in the financial industry, or in medicine, you kind of have to. Because when you introduce a bug in a space, like a rocket, or a space system, or an orbital satellite of some sort, you risk people's lives, you risk billions of dollars of equipment. That's a kind of software bug that I don't have to deal with because I write web applications, and it's not that. It's not that. If I write a bug and someone experiences it, it's inconvenient. It doesn't kill them. There's a pretty big difference there. So if you have to live within a zero-bug software environment, within that constraint, you have to think very differently and very creatively about your unit testing. And I don't know if anyone was here for the previous talk, but This goes beyond unit testing. This goes to scientific peer review of every line of code. And you have to think very differently about automating that sort of process, because your code is extremely important. Now I have to unfortunately turn my back to read this, but there's a great quote by Rob Dunn. Trees have evolved in the struggle of plant against plant many times, in vastly different lineages. The highest leaves win, and so trees tend to evolve to be as tall as possible, given the limits of physics and precipitation. Without competition, every forest would be a thick film of green life. Now imagine if nature didn't have these kind of constraints around it, and the Earth would really be covered in just rocks and a thick film of green life. We probably wouldn't have life the way we know it at all here. These constraints from nature helped develop and help produce the evolution that has led us to this point. And because of those constraints, nature kept finding a way around them. They kept trying to fight a way for life itself. And humans have done that for as long as we've been around as well. We run into a constraint, oh, how can we work our way around this? But if the path is open, we just kind of walk there. Path of least resistance, which is great, but you don't tend to think very creatively when you're just walking straight forward and you don't have to do anything about it. Now, I'm not trying to say that constraints are the only thing that inspire creativity. That's absolutely not true. We can be incredibly creative. Who knows this building? So this is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, designed by Gaudí in 1892. I think they started in 1894. They're still working on it. They don't expect to be done until 2030, 2032, so another 15, 16 years or so. This is a masterful cathedral. Who has been there? Just a quick question. Okay, so probably everyone who's been there will agree this is one of the greatest works of human architecture history ever. Right? This is a fantastic piece. The most creative building you've ever seen. It has tiny details in every corner, every crevice. There's phenomenal creativity in this building. It's mind-blowingly beautiful. And Gaudí was given no constraints, essentially. He was told, just go make whatever you can think of, make the most beautiful work, the most beautiful cathedral you can come up with. I'd say he succeeded. It's a beautiful piece of art, in a sense. And he had no constraints. So constraints, they can help creativity, but they're not the only thing for it. We can still be incredibly inspiring and creative without them. Of course, the problem was he also wanted it funded entirely by donations, which makes development on it kind of slow, which is why it's going to take about 140 years for this to be finished. So how do we find constraints in our work? How do we benefit from them? Well, in a sense, as digital workers, we've always worked within a certain constraint, the physical screen, in whatever form it may have been. But within that, not a constraint. It was all digital behind the screen. We could do whatever we wanted. If we wanted, we could have created this vast canvas with text anywhere we wanted, UI controls anywhere we wanted. Would have been incredibly inconvenient to work with, though. Because we kind of figured, you know what, scrolling all the way around, that kind of sucks. So we naturally created the constraint of just vertical scrolling. And whenever we encounter a website that breaks from that pattern, well, people are complaining. Certainly if it's like a high-profile website from some major brand and they create a horizontal scrolling page and everyone's just like, why did you do this? This sucks. So we've had these constraints, and in some ways we didn't. Some of them have been extremely positive, some of them have been less so. For instance, at some point we decided, I think 980 pixels is a really good width for a website. Who remembers those days? It was sort of a collective wisdom emerging from the web design industry, saying like, "Oh, yeah, that's a good width. We'll just stick to this. This is, this is a safe width." And then, of course, it wasn't. And then mobile happened, and it became incredibly clear to everyone now that it wasn't. And when I say mobile happened, I kind of really mean like the iPhone era of smartphones that allowed people to browse and visit and use websites in the same way, or mostly the same way that they were used to on desktops. There were phones before that, there were smartphones before that, and feature phones that could browse the web, but it was often a pretty broken experience, and it wasn't really similar to what we were used to as a website until about 2007. And then everything just sort of like went to shit in a good way. It was just chaos, madness, fun though. I like making websites that work in all these different constraints, different screen sizes, different devices and browsers. They made me think back to 2002 and 3 and 4 when Stuart Butterfield, he ran the 5K contest. Does anyone know or remember the 5K contest? Like 3 people, yeah. So these were contests where he said, go build any website you want, or a web application, can do anything, just a web page of some sort. It can look like anything you want, it can do anything you want, it can be a game, it can be an app. But all of the code and all of the images you use and all of the JavaScript you write for it, all of it has to fit within 5 kilobytes. Of course, you had the naysayers going like, this is ridiculous, we can't do that, it's way too little. My JavaScript library is already 10K, can't do this is ridiculous. And others were, okay, interesting challenge. And then we saw this immense creativity happen. People were coming up with the most fantastic solutions to work within the constraint of having only 5K of code. People wrote entire web apps in JavaScript that generated the interface so that it wouldn't need as much code to actually write out the interface normally. It would generate the code on the fly, generate, like algorithmically generate everything needed to create an entire functioning app that in expanded form was more than 5K, but the original code was within 5K. We saw this amazing creativity, and then of course he ran the contest 2 more times because it was so popular. And then he had this great quote saying, rigid constraints of designing for the web force us to get truly creative. Since the space we have to explore is so small, we have to look harder, get more creative, and that's what makes it all interesting. So true. So true, in fact, that years later, Alyssa Apart did the 10K contest. And instead of 5K, you now had 10 kilobytes of code that you could use, plus 1 or 2 of the major popular libraries being used almost everywhere, like jQuery, etc. And of course, a new constraint, it had to be responsive, because, it was not 2002 anymore. And these, again, that served to be an extremely popular challenge because lots of people created fully fledged apps that are actually, you can do something productive and useful with them. And they fit within 10K. It's fantastic. In a similar vein, there was Dave Shea's CSS Zen Garden. Who's familiar with it? Yeah, most people. The Zen Garden was kind of really important at its time. He brought it back recently, relaunched it with an updated experience and focused more on the modern day web development and design principles. But back then, in 2003, people were not as convinced by CSS. A lot of people were just saying like, CSS is useless, it cannot do layouts, it's so buggy and broken. We should just stick to tables. They've served us really well for all this time. They work really well, they're sturdy and reliable and robust. Now, Dave's constraint in the Zen Garden was simple. Design any website you want. Design whatever experience you want. Use whatever CSS you want. Write any CSS you'd like. But this is the HTML5 you get to use, and you do not get to change it. The only thing you get to change is which CSS file is imported. That's your CSS file, and that's it. Everything else has to be the same. And this proved phenomenally popular. They created thousands of designs for it, and 1,200 really high-profile or high-quality designs, professional designs, for this one simple page. Over 1,200 that were featured. It was so popular that it became a book, interviewing some of the most creative creators and designers for the site, or for the various Zen Garden themes. But more importantly, what this did was, this helped establish something very fundamental to today's web design principles, which is you use CSS and it's extremely capable. It's extremely flexible. We can do almost anything with it. And people proved that. And it was the most compelling argument because people basically stopped using tables very shortly after the popularity of the Zen Garden took off. And that was pretty important for the web design industry and community. But it was also just a fantastic observation for seeing how creative people would get just from being told, you may not change the HTML here. That inspired them to do something creative, something more creative than they might have done before that. A lot of people blogged about how it forced them to think in new ways and look at CSS in a different light and look up CSS specs to learn what else they could do with something. This inspired so much creativity. It was fantastic. It also taught us important things about the separation of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which I probably won't have to repeat the benefits thereof at this point, but back then, that was also a really big thing. Even today, it's still important to remember how valuable good maintainable code is, not just for other people who may work in your team, but also for yourself 6 months down the line when you haven't touched that code for a while, and now you're suddenly going back to it and you're like, shit, what the hell was I doing? Who's been there? Yeah, everyone else is just lying. Separation is very important, and CSS Zen Garden helped illustrate that. Of course, I was talking about mobile. Resource constraints are really the biggest thing on mobile. All this cool stuff we can do on desktop browsers and full laptops doesn't always work as well on mobile. Certainly not on the older devices. And I like this photo because it's like all of the iPhones throughout the generations, all the way up to the latest models, which is kind of cool. But the older devices are still in use. Maybe not the very first ones, but the 3G and 3GS still widely used around the world. They're slow compared to everything we have today. But they're being used, and we need to sort of think about that. We need to think about these resource constraints, that we don't stuff our websites full of cool things that we only test on the last 3 models of smartphones and then go okay, well, this is working fine on all of them, so it should be good. Now, of course, with Modernizer, we had API constraints. Well, we had a lot of constraints in the design of this. The API constraints was that it had to be extremely simple. It had to be extremely intuitive and easy to use. The messaging around on the site may not have been that great for it at times, not as effective in doing this, but the API of the library itself was always really clear and simple. And in fact, has only had one tiny change at the very beginning, and since then has not been updated or changed from an API point of view. Stayed the same, still great. And all it does is tell you that, hey, you want to use CSS3 transitions? This browser has them. Oh, this browser doesn't. You can just say modernizer.css transition. It'll be true if the browser has it. It'll be false if the browser doesn't support it. And in the HTML element, it'll add a class saying CSS transitions if the browser has it. No CSS transitions if the browser doesn't. You can fork your JavaScript and you can fork your CSS based on the capabilities of the browser. And that's it. It's super simple. It's really intuitive. You can create beautiful designs and still control exactly what will happen for the user if they don't have support for these cool features you started using there. We also had size constraints. This was something that was going to impact the look and feel of your site or your application, possibly in a dramatic way. So it had to be loaded at the front. Also, if you wanted to use the HTML5 shift that was part of it to enable modern HTML5 elements for older IE browsers, it had to be at the top. It had to be in the head of your page. So it had to be small. It had to be really small. Now, by now we have over 160 tests in there, which is a lot. But you don't need all of them. So we have a builder that allows you to just choose the ones you need, generate a build with just those tests in it. It's super easy and it's really small. Usually, with any of the common set of tests that people use, it's only a couple of kilobytes for the entire thing. And that makes it easy and fast to load. It also had to be fast to execute. Because again, this is something that might change the style of your site visually very, very strongly. And you didn't want to offer your users something like, this is what the site is going to look like whilst it's loading, and then suddenly switch to some other look and feel entirely because they didn't have support for certain features you were using. So it had to execute really fast as well. And we kind of set the bar at 50 milliseconds. And ideally, we wanted it to be 50 milliseconds of load and execution time. But with variable latency and network conditions, we settled for at least 50 milliseconds of full execution time. Anytime before that, it had to be done. And that helped. That was a good constraint for us to set. Now, we tried to be even lower than that. We tried to just be 15, 16, maybe within 20 milliseconds. But depending on the amount of tests you use, it may fluctuate quite a bit. But it helped for us to set that as a goal. It was arbitrary, but it was important because performance is incredibly important. So where's all this going? Where's this whole landscape of constraints leading us? I like to think that what we're seeing slowly, very slowly, is a shift towards opinionated interfaces. Not quite like Hal, though I do appreciate him as an opinionated interface. Also Marvin from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, also very opinionated, mostly depressive, but nice and sarcastic, I like that. But opinionated interfaces, really what they are all about is an interface that by design tells you, don't do this thing. That's actually not as good. Do this thing instead. Interfaces that encourage you a certain direction or in a certain way, and either discourage you or outright prevent you from doing something you might want to do or might feel you need to do, but maybe you don't actually need to do it. It's an interface that doesn't give you a lot of options to fiddle with, in part because we kind of know from research that about 95% of people don't change default options anyway. They leave them at the default because they think, well, that's probably what's best, right? Opinionated interfaces can help really set you in a direction that is good for the work you're trying to do or whatever you're trying to achieve, even if that may not have been what you thought you were about to do. They can also help prevent cognitive load, which is when users are presented with more options or more things than they need to deal with. It's kind of what happens when, as a non-pilot, you see a photo of an airplane cockpit, and you see all these dials and all these levers, and you go like, holy shit. I'm glad I'm not a pilot, because I would not know how to fly this thing. Right? But an actual pilot goes like, well, I know exactly what all of this is. One example of that is my own product, which is presentation software. And we came across a really good example of this, where in PowerPoint or Keynote, if you start to create a new presentation, one of the questions the software asks you is, what resolution do you want your slides to be in? I don't know. I don't care. Why should I care? Something big because I want them to be pretty. I want them to look good, and I want text to look sharp. But why should that matter? Why is that a question the software asks me? And it shouldn't be. That's a question that software can take care of automatically. That's kind of the example where software should be a little bit more opinionated and just think for itself a little bit. I mean, this is by design from the people who create the software, but the software should be like, oh, well, we know that basically any projector in the world is a rectangular projector. Okay. We know that another rectangle fits inside of a rectangle, so that's easy. All we need is an aspect ratio. That's the only thing that really matters. So that's the thing that we just define by ourselves in present date. It's a fixed aspect ratio. And you don't have to worry about slide size. We don't ask you about what resolution, because it's any resolution. It's responsive. It should be any and all resolutions. It should fit to the screen width available, because it's a slide. It's supposed to be big and engaging. It shouldn't be fixed at 1024 or 640 by something. It should just be however big is possible. So we make it however big as possible. But you got to design this into the software that you're making or into the website you're making consciously. You cannot just say like, oh, I'm going to slash this feature here. I'm going to cut this. Oh, we're opinionated software now. That's not how it works. These opinionated principles have to come from a thorough design process where you think about what the user actually needs and maybe also what they're expecting and whether or not what they're expecting is actually what they need or what they think they need, which is a different thing. Is it something that they're just used to? Is it something that they're just sort of like, well, this is how it's always worked? But is that actually beneficial to what you're looking to do? Does that help you achieve your goals? So you have to implement these by design in a way that furthers the user's needs that they actually have, and not necessarily the needs that they think they have or the things they want. That's opinionated software. And you have to pursue simplicity. Simplicity is a constraint in its own way. And it's not about dumbing down features. My iPhone is extremely feature-rich. Lots of apps, lots of features, lots of capabilities. But it's also simple and intuitive to use. I can give it to a 2-year-old, and the child knows how to open it and play with it and tap on things. The simplicity is about making something intuitive for a user, not just stripping out features. Sorry. And making these features available in a way that is obvious for them. Not necessarily obvious for you as an engineer or a designer, because you think in a specific way and you're like, okay, well, at this point I would want this feature. Some people may want it at a different moment and may want it exposed to them at a moment when they need it only, and not at moments when they don't need it. Because having more features in front of you adds to the cognitive load of an interface. If you see a whole row of buttons, you kind of have to think through, okay, which button do I need? You have to look at all of them. Do I even need any of these? That creates cognitive load and distracts the user from actually focusing on the task at hand, on what she's doing. Hypsomatic is also kind of an interesting example of this. They try to simulate the old photo camera, like the really old ones, whether it's Polaroid or whatever. But one of those features was you had to wait for the camera to recharge itself to be able to take another photo. Several seconds. Now, I don't know about you, but when I take photos, I like to actually take photos. Not take a photo and then stand there and then tell people to just like, okay, hold on. Wait for it. Wait for it. Okay, cheese again. Make sure I got a good photo there. You know, they kind of killed themselves with this process. They simulated the experience of an old device in both the good ways and the bad. They also had a tiny viewport. Like, this is on a phone. And like, okay, this looks kind of cool. But when I'm using a phone without an actual viewport, or a camera without an actual viewport to look through, I have to use the screen to take the photo. And they made that screen tiny, tiny, tiny. They shrunk it down to the point where you could barely see what photo you were taking, because they simulated the whole viewport of an old camera. So you can overdo it. You can definitely overdo it. And even Apple has a history of overdoing it. I'm glad they're stopping it. Skeuomorphism is about interfaces behaving similar to how a real-world equivalent might work, or does work. It's not necessarily visual realism, though it often goes hand in hand. Visual realism is making something look like a real-world object. Skeuomorphism is making it, or trying to behave, trying to make it behave like a real-world equivalent. So like a knob to dial, or to turn like this. A really good example of that is the iCal page flip. You know, you want to go to next month? Oh, just flip a page on your calendar. We're on a digital thing. There's no page here. And it's tedious. It took 2 seconds for that thing to complete before you were able to reuse the interface again and go to the next page, next month, if you wanted to. So I was really glad that they canned all of that nonsense, well, most of that nonsense in all the various latest OSs. Because, yeah, everyone can fall prey to doing this stuff that looks cool, that feels kind of cool, but may not actually serve the user in his or her needs. Leather buttons. Seriously, who's ever seen a leather button in the real world? That was awful. So anyway, I'd like you to think and go away from this talk thinking about how constraints in your work can inspire creativity, how you may be able to actually impose certain constraints on your project, on your design, constraints you don't have a need for, but that might be an interesting challenge for you. That might prove, or that might force you to think in a more unique or a different way about what you're about to do, the work you're doing, the design you're making. Set creative constraints around your work, also in your hobby. Like I like writing, and so sometimes I set very specific and completely arbitrary constraints, like, okay, today I'm going to write specifically 100 words for this piece, or specifically 501 words for that piece. It makes no sense, but it forces me to think very differently about what kind of sentences I use, especially closer to the end, and whether I can fit my whole message in there or not. Think about resources that you use, and can you reuse them more efficiently and more creatively, the way Gary Chang and Rietveld did? Or about budgetary constraints. Can you be more effective and efficient using less costly resources? But above all, do pursue your dream of creative and innovative work like Gaudi did, even if you're not building a cathedral. Thank you very much. We have some questions?
Yes. 3 questions.
Okay. Are constraints only good if they force you to break other self-imposed boundaries? No. They can be good, they can be bad under any circumstance, really. Obviously, certain constraints are just painful or annoying, and you don't want to work with them. But what they do encourage is a new creative way of thinking around those constraints, or within them, really. Like, can I still make this app the way I had envisioned it within this constraint that I'm suddenly forced to work within? Or even if it's even if it is a self-imposed one, it can be useful to work within that constraint and see if you can work within it. And if not, if it's self-imposed, you can break free from it a little. How do you decide what artificial constraints to make? That is a good one. That's also a tough one. I think it's about trying to perceive opportunities. And sometimes that opportunity becomes readily apparent. Maybe it's inspired by something someone else did. Sometimes you kind of just have to take a step back and look at your work in a bigger picture sense and go like, okay, we've built all this stuff. We've written all this code. Have we been sort of like behaving like North America city building? Have we just been going all over the place and not really thinking about how big our code base is becoming, how performant our app is? And sometimes taking that step back really helps. Helps you kind of get the clearer picture of where things are going and if you're still heading in the right direction with everything. And other times it's just a matter of sitting down and thinking, okay, how can we create some constraints in this that would actually benefit us? Because just saying like, oh, I'm going to say 5 kilobytes of code for this toolkit I'm writing right now, no more. That can be useful, but if it's something that's comprehensive and really needs to be interoperable with other stuff, it might not actually be a particularly relevant constraint to create, or it might be the wrong constraint to impose on yourself. Maybe 15K would be better suited. Maybe no file size constraint and some other type of constraint would be better. What's the next? Use CSS instead of tables. I'm not sure. It's interesting. I see a lot of stuff happening with Canvas now. I think there's an inherent potential to Canvas and using Canvas for new and interesting things, especially because we can load images into them, manipulate them, extract data out of them, and then repurpose that data or reuse the image in a new form. But what I don't see as much is people making accessible things in Canvas, thinking about what it means to also, create this thing that you're creating for screen reader users or, other forms of accessibility that you may need to consider for the purposes. I think from a web perspective, we're seeing so much stuff happen at the same time everywhere that it's no longer a singular best practice or best approach to do something anymore. We have so many toolkits and frameworks to work with. We have so many boilerplate templates and responsive design frameworks we can choose from. And many of them serve slightly different purposes. Now, in some ways, that's great. We have options to choose from. In other ways, it's less great because you spend a lot of time researching them, figuring out which one is exactly right for you, and whether or not they can interplay well with each other. And that's particularly true with JavaScript libraries that just kind of go like, okay, well, this is my library, have fun. And then you find out it doesn't work with this other library you use. So then someone makes a micro library to glue the two together and make them work with each other. And that has piled on and on for a number of years now to the point where we have thousands of these. Sifting through that is kind of a pain. There are entire websites made to help you with this, to help figure out which library is the right one for you. But it's all kind of about having different purposes. We're making such completely different websites and applications now that the different purposes have different needs. And we are catering more effectively to all those different needs. And I think our industry has become so big and so all-encompassing at this point that there is no singular answer anymore for like, this is the best way of doing it. I mean, in many ways there never was, but now that has expanded in scope and there's a million opportunities for everything to exist and reasons for everything to exist. And you have 1,000 things you can choose for your one project. And it's just a matter of figuring out which one. And that's it for questions. Thank you.